Star Wars Episode II Attack of the Clones for Game Boy Advance is an abomination of a video game. Forget the fact that this is based off the middle chapter of the polarizing Star Wars prequel trilogy. That's irrelevant, that's not a factor, set that piece of business aside. This is an absolutely horrible video game that somehow got approved for distribution, somehow got through quality assurance, and somehow got licensed by Nintendo for play on your Nintendo Game Boy Advance. There is a grave disturbance of the Force here, or possibly somewhere else, but it is emanating from this thing that somehow got called a video game. When you start Attack of the Clones, you get this title screen with the Imperial March playing in the background for some reason. Apparently the folks behind the music in this game thought that they were making the soundtrack for a game based off The Empire Strikes Back, and that's why we got this. And in all fairness, it's not a bad rendition of the tune. A little upbeat for my taste, but not bad. I've heard worse. And then there's the opening crawl. Hey, they managed to squeeze in the John Williams composed Star Wars theme in there. Sounds pretty good. A bit rough, but pretty good. And hey, these cutscenes aren't too bad either. Some text underneath a still shot from the movie, which isn't too bad. It does a nice job of compressing all the boring bits of the movie into one screenshot and one block of text that you could skip at least. And then it all goes to hell. This, my friends, is Attack of the Clones on Game Boy Advance, a side-scrolling platform game where you walk a few inches before getting ambushed by enemies. Once you kill all the enemies that ambushed you, you get to walk a few more inches before running into another ambush. That's the gist of this thing over and over and over again. Suddenly all the lessons and developments garnered from 3 incredibly successful Super Star Wars video games on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System from the 1990s, all of that thrown out the airlock faster than George Lucas threw out the original theatrical versions of the Star Wars trilogy into the nether realm of nothingness, never again to see the light of day. Control is the primary culprit in Attack of the Clones. Of course it is. And this is one of those games where you cannot reconfigure your control scheme. That's a minor bit at first, but in a double dose of double dumbassery on you, the controls are inverted. That's right, folks. Your B button is for jumping, and your A button is for swinging about your lightsaber. You'd figure these game designers would have learned something about basic side-scroller design on a Nintendo handheld, but I suppose David A. Palmer Productions didn't get the memo in that regard because, well, I guess they were too busy trying to get Doom to work on the bloody thing. And since I brought it up, I might as well, get it out of the way. Doom on the Game Boy Advance is actually pretty good. Much better than I expected to. Sure, it's based off the console versions rather than the PC version, but still, it's not that bad of a port. But that's another story for another time. So like I said, B is for jumping, A is for you swinging around your lightsaber. Should be fairly simple, even if they reverse the button mapping. But what they implemented for a control scheme in Attack of the Clones is neither functional nor intuitive. One does not simply press the A button to attack. Oh no, that would be too logical. That would make too much sense. That's been done before. No, what one does is hold down the A button, and from there you use the directional pad to attack in any of the 4 directions. You swing your lightsaber to the left by pressing left and A, and I get what they're trying to go for here, I really do, but it just doesn't work that well. Attacks come off as slow as cumbersome. Your Jedi, either Anakin Skywalker or Obi-Wan Kenobi, or in one instance Nick Fury, are too slow to react to basic commands, and there's a bit of questionable collision detection. Jumping works well enough, except if you want to turn around. If you land and turn in the other direction, you can't jump if you press the button right away. It's kind of awkward and probably an issue when it comes to fine platforming, and there's quite a bit of fine platforming to be done. Your jump kick works fine, however, for whatever that's worth. And you could deflect shots by holding down the R trigger and fiddling around with a D-pad. You could do a high jump by holding down the L trigger and pressing up, although that takes up force energy. And as you collect more force energy by defeating enemies, you could also perform a force push, and a full force meter means you could eventually perform a screen clearing attack. But with a full force meter, whenever you kill an enemy, they will eventually drop health pickups, and that ends up being a much more useful feature than whatever force ability the game gives you due to the number of enemies that the game will throw at you, especially when the screen is locked at certain points in the level. But generally speaking, the core gameplay itself is pretty boring. You move along a stage, fight enemies, keep moving, fight enemies, etc, etc, etc. That continues for a few more times. Sometimes they'll throw a curveball and have you navigate doors and hallways to look for keys, but it's all the same thing in the end. The action is slow and barren, it's not very exciting. Perhaps worst of all, they made a game about swinging a little laser sword around to slice hundreds of disposable robots in half, an absolute bore. Terrible. For the most part, you're playing as Anakin Skywalker, but at times you'll take control of either Obi-Wan Kenobi, or for one level at least you'll even take command of Lawrence Fishburne. Suffice it to say, they all play pretty much the same way, with no real differences between them outside of their sprite set. Not that it really matters though. Oh, and there are also vehicle stages. Works well enough, but they're only a couple levels out of 12-ish, and really, who cares? In terms of graphics, Attack of the Clones is... well, the cutscenes are nicely rendered at least. The characters are nice and large, the level backdrops are somewhat well rendered. I'm sort of stretching at this point, but honestly it doesn't look too bad on a smaller Game Boy screen as opposed to a bigger screen, I guess. The animation of Jedi is rather smooth, the vehicle stages are actually pretty decent. How the fuck did this get good reviews on GameFAQs, for fuck's sake? Seriously, I'd really like to know that. Sound is generally bland, surprising considering a lot of these Star Wars titles on Game Boy Advance had some semblance of decent sound quality, but here it's just a bit bland, whether it's the subpar quality of the sound effects or the rather forgettable background. You know, I don't care anymore. I really don't. The Game Boy Advance interpretation of Star Wars Episode II Attack of the Clones is an unmitigated misstep in the Star Wars legacy of video games, owing to numerous issues that makes the game a burden to play. Control is crap, gameplay is boring, the vehicle stages are... well, they're probably the only real bright spot, and I sort of wish they made more of these. Then again, considering Flight of the Falcon, a year or so later, it's probably for the best that they didn't. Look, as much as people tend to dislike the actual film this thing is based on, it's nowhere near as bad as plotting through the game that bears its name. For all intents and purposes, Attack of the Clones, the video game, is a bust.